There's some sort of natural instinct that the clock hits 6:30 and everyone falls into this moment of silence. My name is Ingrid Schroeder, for those who don't know me. I'm the director here at the AA, and it's my absolute delight to welcome Paul, although I don't need to welcome you to the AA, but to this evening, and Kat Rossi, who will be doing a proper introduction and some responses to your talk. It's also with great delight, and I hope this is semi-public knowledge, that we're publishing the material, some of which we'll see tonight. And when that came across the desk of the editorial board, I think couldn't have been more excited about the focus and the extraordinary quality of the topic and the work that's been put into this. I know this has been a long labor of love. I think it's also a wonderful topic and a difficult topic to bring to the evening tonight. I think that we always associate the 60s and 70s with liberation, but liberation under one of the longest dictators in living history or living memory is a really challenging and extraordinary kind of precursor to the world in which we inhabit now. So I know that everyone I've spoken to over the past week has been looking forward to tonight. That's why we have such a rammed space. So welcome Paul, welcome Kat.
Hi, evening everyone. So yeah, thank you to Paul and to the AA for inviting me to be here to really play this very minor player role of introducing Paul, and then we're going to have a conversation afterwards, and then there might be time for a couple of questions as well, and then the discussion will continue, I'm sure. So just to introduce Paul to those of you that don't know him, he teaches here, obviously, to Studio Master here at the AA, and also a senior scientific researcher in the chair of architecture and care at ETH Zurich. And he also co-founded and co-runs, and I'm going to try really hard not to destroy your beautiful Spanish language, Goich Architecture Studio, which means Goich is around ideas of pleasure, which seems very fitting as a name for the studio, which operates across Barcelona and London, and which is focused on residential, but also exhibition and educational work, and in particular art-focused projects. And your work, both your individual and collaborative work, has been published widely and also exhibited widely, including in the Venice Biennale in 2023, I think that's right. And then last year, in terms of publications, you published Arquitectos Peligrosas, which means dangerous architecture. And it's a collection of essays that explores themes including space and architecture in relation to sexuality and gender and care and pleasure. And that was published last year in Spanish and is coming out, I believe, in English. And I'm looking forward to that. And you're saying that's a culmination of 9 years' worth of essays, which, a really nice way of also tracking your thinking. And some of those themes are going to appear, I believe, in tonight's lecture. Yeah. And we had a pre-chat last week or the week before about what we were going to say tonight. And luckily, we both agreed we can't really remember how or where exactly we got in contact, which kind of like a good quality of kind of hazy details of a good night out. But it's not entirely clear. But I know it was good, and we wanted to continue the conversation. And we've had a couple of opportunities to do that, which is kind of why I'm here tonight with you. So we first met on our way to Villeneuve near Marseille, where we were both speaking as part of a very small but wonderful exhibition called Bois de Nuit. And that's where I really first heard you talk about this kind of trilogy, or this trio of technologies of audio, visual, and psychotropic substances as really defining nightclub architecture. And it's that combination of tangible and intangible qualities that has really helped me think through my own kind of understanding and research into understanding the kind of design history of nightlife. And since then, I've had a couple of opportunities to help you think more about that and kind of get the word out there on your research. So in 2018, that was in a catalogue essay for Night Fever, which was an exhibition I co-curated for Vitra Design Museum. And you laid out that conceptual framework, but also really crucially gave us some important material on kind of pre-Ibiza Spain in the 1960s, which really, as you know, more than anybody, hasn't really been looked at all. And then currently, we're in the final throes of putting together another co-edited book called Beyond the Dance Floor. And you've put together this chapter on go-go dancers in 1960s Spain and looked very meticulously at their dress, at their makeup, at their postures, at the material spatial qualities of the podiums. And I think for the images alone, it's one of my favourite chapters in the book, which I probably shouldn't say, but it's true. And then in between all of that, you also did your PhD, and I will read the title for that properly, which was The Emergence of the Architectural Genre of the Discotheque in Francoist Spain, 1951 to 1973. And I was lucky enough to be your examiner for that. And in terms of what you're going to talk about tonight, some of it's that, some of it's new material that I also haven't heard before. And I think that willingness to try out things, to share new ideas, is really a kind of compliment to you, and we're very lucky to be able to hear that. So, yeah, that's completely enough of me, and I think we're in for a treat. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kat, for this fantastic introduction. Thank you for being here tonight as well and sharing the conversation later. But also thank you for all these encounters and invitations over the years that helped to shape what I will be presenting tonight as well. Also, thank you, Ingrid, for the introduction. I will be presenting, as it has been said, one part of my PhD. A PhD is very long. It was 700 pages. It's impossible to present it in 1 hour, but I will present 2 propositions around that PhD. It was also a long process of research. It took many, many years going to small villages in the coast of Spain, trying to uncover all these discotheques that appeared during the late 50s, 60s, until the beginning of the 70s, that don't exist anymore, that had been completely forgotten, and that I had no idea that they existed. So I was going to this archive, befriending the archivist and trying to ask them if they could help me to unearth all these evidences of these discotheques that populated the coast of Spain. I want to also say thank you to Ian Borden, who is in the public tonight, for guiding me through the process of the PhD. Also thank you to the friends, family, colleagues of supporting me through all these years of dedicated research. And before going into the topic, I would like to situate a little bit how this research started. So when I started the PhD, I had this very ambitious idea that I will trace a genealogy of the discotheque in the world. No? It was like, okay, I'm going to see where in the world the first discotheque appeared, and I will trace this kind of history of the discotheques. And my first intuition was, okay, I should go to New York, no? Because that's kind of the cliche that we all have, that disco culture appears in New York and that the first discotheque should be in New York. So I got some money and I went to New York and I went to the archives in New York and I was looking for it. And I was a bit disappointed because, yes, of course, there were very famous discotheques, but they were mostly in the 70s. And I was looking for something earlier. No? I wanted to see if there was something in the 60s. And in the 60s in New York, there was a culture of twist and rock music. There were spaces to dance to this kind of music. They were nightclubs, but they were not exactly discotheques, and I will explain why. And actually, Tim Lawrence is an historian of nightlife in New York, says by the end of the 60s, there was almost no place to go out in New York. But suddenly, I was finding some signs that there were other places in which actually there were discotheques during the 60s. This is a review from the early 70s by musicologist Simon Frith, and was saying that the most wonderful Eurodiscos of all actually are in the holiday belts. They are in 2 places in Spain, in the Costa Brava and the Costa del Sol. And also, almost by chance, I found an archive. I found an archive of the daughter of an Italian architect called Vincenzo Carmenati, who was living in Costa Brava, in Plachadaro, which is the town where the first discotheques appeared in Spain. I will know it later. And by finding that archive, I found a full amount of material about one particular discotheque that blown my mind, which was Maddox. I didn't know that that existed. My family comes from I'm Catalan, I'm from that area, but my family comes from the Pyrenees in the mountains. I was not familiar with the coast. I didn't know that all these discotheques existed. It's out of the popular memory as well. And I found these images of that fantastic place. And it was not only beautiful or fantastic or in terms of architectural design quite surprising, but it also was quite early. It was in the mid-60s. So it was before many of the other places that I had seen. And I also found things like this. this is a newsreel of the Franco government. It was like a propaganda tool. They were showing it, it was compulsory to show it in all the cinemas of the country. This is from early 70s. And basically the newsreel shows what is the new profession of technician of discotheques. And explains that this is a very serious profession. It's a profession that has a future because there is a lot of discotheques and there is a lot of demand for discotheques. And it's also a very rigorous profession because you need to have a scientist approach to it. No? And you see in the images how they characterize the people researching about discotheques as if they were scientists in a laboratory, and how they also say you need to be very careful on how do you play music, how do you regulate the sound, how do you produce a sound environment. You need to be absolutely careful as well on how to use lighting and how do you produce a light environment. And the discotheque is, they say, the evolution of what used to be the café concert. They use this kind of word, but also the dance hall or more traditional forms of dance venues, and how this is overtaking all these other dance venues and how it's the future profession in Spain. So I was surprised to see that the dictatorship was promoting this kind of spaces and was promoting to work into this kind of spaces.
De su habilidad puede depender en gran manera el éxito del establecimiento.
They say also that there is this new profession which is being a DJ, no? And they call it the musical selector, and it depends on that person how the taste of the place will be. So here comes my first proposition of the two that I will present tonight, and it's around the idea of abuse. Now, seeing this video and understanding that the dictatorship was promoting the technologies and the discotheque as a form of architectural practice and also as a profession, how does it come that in Spain it happens this introduction of technological development into the design of a space? And I like to start with this idea of technological abuse. Actually, Skiller, who says that entertainment industry is, in any conceivable sense of the word, an abuse of military equipment. I find interesting this proposition, and obviously has been investigated in different ways how military warfare technologies from the First and Second World Wars have entered, for instance, the domestic space. Colomina has done that. Virilio has also investigated how certain technologies from war have entered, for instance, the space of entertainment, but not specifically the space of the discotheque, the popular dance space that became prominent in Spain. So for that, I wanted to define also what was the discotheque. And I thought that the best idea to define what the discotheque is in relationship to the technologies was to find a law that will describe what a discotheque is. So the earliest law that I managed to find describing what a discotheque is a law from the late 70s, precisely passed here in London, that was called Disco Rules OK. This was like a brochure to promote that law. And there is one article that says, for the purpose of this code, discos are defined as events characterized by loudly amplified music, dancing, flashing lights, and mostly attracting people under the age of 30. Obviously, if we remove this last part of the under the age of 30, that it's questionable. Also because actually the first discotheques in Spain were welcoming bodies from all kind of ages. But it's true as well that the discotheque became kind of a channel for youth culture. There is 2 points that I'm interested in this definition. One is that they are defined by amplified music, so reproduced music, and also by flashing lights. They don't mention the geometry of the space, if it's open or closed, if it's this kind of architecture or another. It's not about the tectonic elements, no? But what defines a discotheque is the implementation of these technologies and producing an atmosphere or a space through these technologies. It's not so explicit in the code, but it's implicit because they talk about bad things that can happen in the discotheques, that there is a third technology as well, which is drugs. So I end up with this triad of technologies, which is lighting, sound, and psychotropic technologies being the technologies that define the discotheque. So if we go back to military equipment of warfare, we will see that, as I was saying, during the First and Second World War was a series of technological developments in these particular fields, no? In lighting, sound, and psychotropic technologies. And these were tested in the battleground. For instance, searchlights, no? To spot the enemy, but also blind lights to blind the enemy. We see also the development of technology to reproduce low-frequency sounds for the first time, how to use low-frequency sounds to affect the bodies of the enemy by affecting their bowels. We see this is the UK Royal Marine experimenting with LSD, so being under the effects of LSD, but it was not only LSD, it was also amphetamines, but it was also MDMA. So there was experiments with the militaries, with all the drugs that then there will become definitory, actually, of the dense spaces. And how does it happen that there is this transfer, let's say, of knowledge from the military into the leisure industry or the leisure complex, and particularly how it happens in Spain, because it's one of the first territories in which this takes place. So there is an event, particularly, it's a geopolitical event, which is the Pax of Madrid in the 50s. Spain, the dictatorship was on the border of bankruptcy. And the states were interested in the Iberian Peninsula as a geographically strategic place to situate some military bases that were used to control the Cold War, but also the Korean War. So they come to an agreement in 1953, and Spain says, okay, you can put the military bases here, and the states, through the Fondo Monetario Internacional, the International Monetary Fund, I guess in English, they agree to give a loan to Spain. And this loan will be used to transform the economy of the Spain. Until the moment, it was an autarky, it was self-contained, it was a subsistence economy. And at that moment, there is the intention to open the country to the exterior. And there is one specific person called Joan Cerdà de Cheus that had been part of the Republican side during the war, and that was very familiar with Costa Brava, with this coast on the North Mediterranean part of Spain, because he had been there before the war, and the first attempts to do a tourist industry had emerged at that time. This person came to London to study in the London School of Economics, came back to Spain and made all these plans, a stabilization plan in the late 50s and development plans during the 60s that will transform Spain radically, and that will put tourism and experience economy in the main, as the biggest, let's say, economical activity of the country. We can see in this graph how in the 50s there was no visitors in Spain, and by the end of the 60s it's more than 20 million people entering Spain for tourist purposes. At that moment, Spain becomes the country in the world with the highest number of tourists. This tendency will continue until the present. Now it's more than 100 million people coming to Spain, and partially still coming for the idea of the party. No? So this cliche of Spain, fiesta, alegría, and so on, it doesn't come from nowhere, actually, but it was like a construction, a political construction due to geopolitical, actually, interests. This comes with the development of infrastructures. So the first discotheques appear in relationship to the development of highways. The first highway in Spain is the highway that goes along the coast, and that connects with the highways in Europe. So they can allow for the visitors. There is freedom of currencies coming in, but there is also freedom of visitors coming in. And it's through these highways that the visitors will enter the country. We start seeing all these images in the late 50s and early 60s of all the cars queuing in summer on the border of France trying to enter into Spain. And that's why, if we look at the map with a bit more detail, why that area on the top, which is Costa Brava that I was mentioning before, is where the first discotheques appear, because it's where the first tourists arrived. No? They started building the highway from the top, and they continued until the bottom, so it took a while to get into Malaga and Costa del Sol. That was in the early 60s with the first discotheques, and then in the mid-60s they also opened an airport that is still operated by low-cost companies. Ryanair is operating now in Girona, and that will open exactly the day that opens what I consider the first proper finished discotheque. No? So they go in parallel. The visitors arrive by plane. Here we can see the first plane arriving in that airport with dancers or visitors from Denmark. This goes along with a very rapid urbanization of the coast. This will be a full other chapter that you could talk about the relationship of the discotheque and the urbanization of the coast, because most of the investors will ask for night leisure. So foreign investors will build hotels and apartments if there is a beach and if there is night leisure. So it was the local investors which will actually build the first discotheques to attract the investment into hotels and apartments and so on. And we can see here in Platja d'Aro, which is this town in Costa Brava in which the first discotheques will appear, that in 10 years it goes from nothing, basically two fishermen there in little houses, into a proper holiday resort town. But there is also another particularity of why the discotheque appears in that part of Spain particularly. It's close to the border, the tourists arrive there, but also there is an anthropologist that in the 60s did a fantastic investigation of the Costa Brava during 10 years. She was French, Yvette Barbaza, and she said there was something missing in Catalonia, in that part of the coast, and it was folklore. Because in the southern parts of Spain, they had sevillanas, no? They had these tablaos, they had these cortijos, and at night, they knew how to entertain the tourists. Like, come there, we will all dance sevillanas, we'll dance flamenco, and then we will spend a fantastic night. But in Catalonia, all the folkloric dances and traditions and rituals are a little bit more sad, or at least more quiet, let's say. They work very well on a Sunday morning, but it's not the kind of thing that you would like to do on a Saturday crazy night. So Yvette Barbaza said they had to find other solutions. And the solution was to use pre-recorded music, also for economy. And I like Sarah Thornton when does this analysis of the enculturation of discs. She does a global analysis of the enculturation of discs and says basically that discs go from the private realm, so discs existed in houses, people will listen to music in their house, but when do they become public and where do they go into a dance floor? And it says that it mostly happened in places where there was a lack of money and there was young people. In Catalonia, there was a lack of money at that moment. No? They wanted to produce all these infrastructures for the tourists, but they were relatively poor. It was much cheaper to put a disc than to actually hire a band, which was much more expensive. There were complaints, obviously, from the local musicians because they wanted to play, so there was a whole controversy around it, but the use of discs started to become popular. What is interesting to us, however, as architects, is how this use of this becomes an architecture itself, how it becomes a spatial experience. And at the beginning, there is a first occupation of existing buildings. So there was a lot of farms that were abandoned. There was an agrarian crisis. So you had all these farms close to the coast. And the first license that I managed to find, it was from 1958, in which this farm was reconverted into a dance space. And it was licensed to only dance to recorded music. So it was like a very traditional construction, but the license say, yes, you can open every night and you can put recording music. There will be a space for dancing. You need to close the bedroom so not bad things happen there. And you can keep on with your business. These started to appear there. But then in parallel, there was the emergence of new constructions next to the coast. In Spain, we have this word called chiringuito, and it's quite nice when, I'm not going to go into the details of the history of this, but in very short, there was farmers that had lands close to the beaches, no? And they realized that there were tourists going to the beach and said, okay, why don't we put a little construction and we sell some drinks? And then they realized it was very successful. And they said, oh, why don't we bring a musician from the village? And then they put a musician. And they said, oh, why don't we bring a disc and then we play music? So it became a construction with music and dancing and so on. And this very precarious construction started to take shape and becoming the discotheque. So in the turn of the 50s to the 60s, we have what I call proto-discotheques. They were not yet discotheques fully on, but they started to show some of the characteristics of them. In most occasions, they were open air because there was no money to do a full building. So they will just make a wall, as you can see here around, and they will put 2 dance floors. This is a mystery that I haven't resolved, but most of the first, or many of the first proto-discotheques and discotheques will have 2 dance floors. 2 dance floors with a single ambience. So it's not that you have 2 dance floors with different music, therefore it makes sense because it's 2 dance floors. They always break symmetries as well. So one potential explanation is the traditional dance hall is always symmetrical. You have a stage because you have a band, and then you have sitting areas around. But here, you don't see where the music comes from. We don't know actually where the speakers were in these initial proto-discotheques. We know that there is no stage. We have these 2 dance floors. Also, we know that there is a transition from dancing in couple to dancing individually. So there is this kind of break of symmetry. I don't know if the dance floor could be explained, this duplicity of the dance floor from this break of symmetry. We see also that they always have a parking, an area to park cars, because most of these spaces were not exactly in the town. They were a bit outside. They were very close to the beach, 500 meters maximum most of the times, and they were next to a road. So you could arrive by car. No? So these tourists that will drive there, the French tourists and German tourists and so on, and British tourists will arrive there, park here, go in and have a night in the proto-discotheque. This is another example. You start seeing hints, for instance, in this one, that they were marking where the light could go. So we see some light decorations in some parts of this floor plan. It was a space that was completely open air. We see that they tended to be secluded either by a wall or by vegetation itself. We can see here the entrance. It's in the middle almost of a forest. We see the space there with some of the furniture that in winter will be folded, put away, it will close, and it will reopen the following summer. This is another example, again, with the two darker, dense floors. We see that there is only facilities, the minimum, so 2 toilets, a bit of a bar, and not much more. Here, the architect in this particular one was already mentioning, I will use a slightly different level so I can play with different views towards the dance floor. This is very subtle. We can see that there is some steps there. We can see that there are speakers, and these speakers are facing towards the dance floor. We can see also that it's still in the middle of the forest and completely open air for the exception of the bar area. Slowly they start to get covered. So for instance, we here have an example that half of it was covered, half of it was uncovered. The left part was inside, the right part was outside, with the 2 dance floors again. You keep seeing these very orthogonal geometries. Most of the architects designing these discotheques were local architects. They were trained, most likely, it's difficult to trace their histories because they are completely anonymous most of the times, but most likely they were educated in the School of Barcelona, that at that time had this tendency towards functionalism and rationalism, and we see this kind of architectural gestures in these discotheques, some sort of pictorial floor plan sometimes, no, like modern form of language. A very minimal also expression of the architecture. We can see in the space that there is like this cover, but the lines are quite simple. The use of materials is quite precarious, like a certain form of regionalist understanding of material use and building techniques. Many of the spaces adopt also names in relationship to the new musical genres that come from the Caribbean diaspora. So we have salsa, calypso, bossa nova arriving at that time. And we see, for instance, here some decorations as well that link with this kind of musical genres that arrive to be played in these initial proto-discotheques. We see here a further refined floor plan. Again, the 2 dance floors, this kind of formal language as well of modern architecture. A particularity in this one that will be common with many of them and is the inclusion of the living dependencies of the workers inside the discotheque. So this will give for another full discussion of class relationships in discotheques, no? Because you have the workers with their rooms, the room of the director of the discotheque that it's bigger and has a kitchen himself, but the rest not, and then direct connection with the dancing areas. And these discotheques were running almost all day as well. So it's not like now that we are used that the discotheque starts at night and finishes, I don't know, at 6 a.m., but actually this will start at 2 p.m. and then it will run until the morning after. So they will have a few hours to rest in the morning and then they will continue, and they were living here because most of them were also migrant workers that were coming from other parts of Spain. But what is interesting of this one is also that it was the first discotheque, and that's recorded, that incorporated stereo sound. So the technology started making its way into these spaces, and also was the first discotheque to have the floors, the dance floors, translucent and with sparkling lights under. For the moment, the lights are under the dance floor, are not yet on top, but they already made their way into the discotheque. And also the stereophonic sound. We don't know where the speakers are, it's not indicated. We don't know where the DJ is as well. There is no trace of the DJ yet. It has to be hidden somewhere there, but it's not prominent in architectural terms, let's say. We can see as well the construction, simple brick walls, simple metal structures to sustain a very thin roof, completely open air, summer-oriented. And here, in the mid-60s, there is the turn towards the discotheque. This is the first completely closed space for dancing to recorded music. It is completely closed, still have 2 dance floors, one bigger, one smaller, but it has big windows because it's next to the sea and they want to see the sea, and it's written by the architect. So it was closed, they had an envelope, but still it was not completely insulated from the exterior. No? It was still a relationship with the landscape. But the real turn into the conversion of these proto-discotheques into the discotheque is when it becomes a completely concealed box. And that happens in 1964. The project was from 63, but this what we consider like maybe the first Spanish discotheque, upon which many others will actually be built after, was Tiffany's. And as you can see in the picture, it was a completely enclosed box. There was no windows. There was only one door to enter, and that was it. And as the advertising says, it was a nightclub for dancing, to bars. It had a stereophonic sound. It had also air conditioning, which was a key question that arrived also at the time in Spain. So these spaces were possible because the air conditioning was installed for the first time in hospitals and in discotheques. These were the two places where air conditioning arrived. And what is interesting about this space is not only that it's closed, but actually we see for the first time that the architect specifically mentions where the speakers have to be. So there is a dance floor in the middle. Here there is only one dance floor because in 64 it opened like this, but in 65 it already expanded and had a second dance floor. But in this configuration we see this dance floor, which is this square in the middle, and in the three little angles on the corners it says altavoces, that means speakers. And on the other side we see this kind of Y that says tocadiscos, that means turntable. So it's the first time that in the floor plan an architect says, okay, here there will be a DJ, without using the word DJ yet, and here there will be the speakers that are surrounding the people that is dancing. So if we look at the pictures of the time, this was this kind of precarious DJ booth that looks more like a fireplace than a DJ booth at the time, with this kind of stone walls. But we can see already how the technologies arrived there. No? So we see a recording tape there, a magnetic recording tape that was quite common at the time in DJ booths, because they will use it as well to record sessions, so they will play them while they were not DJing. And there was also two turntables. And this became a turning point as well. First of all, because we see the technologies. Before we know that there was recorded music there, but we never saw who was playing this. And actually, as Sarah Thornton says, there is a history of the enculturation of the DJ and how at the beginning was not considered as an artistry. No? So the DJ was like another waiter that was putting music and that's it. And at this point, the DJ becomes a figure that has a certain form of art and therefore it's exposed to the public, but also the technology becomes a prestige. No? So showing this technology is a form of prestige for that discotheque. And it's out of necessity, the DJ of Tiffany's, which was actually a Swiss man that then went back to Switzerland and retired there, opening a lot of discotheques, Jean-Pierre Gatzer, explains that in the 60s, he started testing how to link one song with another, which was not a common technique. So he didn't have a mixer yet. He didn't have the technology to allow to jump from one disc to the other. But what he was doing was putting some glue in the record to mark the beginning and the end of the different tracks, and then with some sort of technique, he will connect one with the other. And in the reports of the time of that area, it says that people were going there to learn from him, no? And then they will go into the other discotheques, and this way they invented this possibility of having a continuous sound. At the beginning, mostly in discotheques, they were talking, no? The DJs, they were saying, I'm going to put this song, and they play the song, and then they talked after the song and put another song. And here is the first time that they decided to just continue with the music. This can be connected as well with certain understandings of economical profit, no? Because we can see in some discotheques later how they explain that they use this continuous music to tire the dancers, and then they will go to drink, so they will go back to the dance floor and they will tire them more. So it's important that the music continues all the time, no? If we think of this discotheque as a machine, a money machine for the tourists. But what is interesting along the exposure of the sonic technologies is also how they imagined this ceiling that was a massive lighting installation. In the report it says there were 400 lighting points, and they were suspended in this kind of sticks from a grid, and above the grid there was again more lights, and also the air conditioning. So there was like a complex kind of ceiling system that allowed for different forms of light and also thermic effects to come down on the public. Gratzer, the DJ, says that all style magazines reported about Tiffany's because no one had ever seen what visitors found there. The club was in a modern darkroom, so it was for the first time a black box completely, and it had lighting systems rather than lighting festoons. So the idea of having a system of lighting that was actually projected above the dancers. And now we will see a clip of how that turned up into the inside of Tiffany's. This is a very interesting clip. It's from a film by Jacinto Esteve, which is a critique to the regime of Franco. And it's a film that starts with these images of the discotheque in Tiffany's, recorded in the middle of the 60s, and then continues showing all the interior parts of Spain with more religious rituals and festivities, and puts a sharp contrast between what does it mean, the discotheque, versus the ancestral forms of inhabitation in Spain. So this is Tiffany's. You need to think also that this is in a fisherman's village, no, at that moment, and that 5 years before there was nothing there, and suddenly this appears. So Tiffany's was the first one because it was enclosed, because it was dark, because it had the lights, and it was the exposure also of the DJ and the technologies. But Maddox is the one that brought it to another level of also architectural understanding of how this envelope could somehow support all this technology inside the discotheque. And we can see it already, a radical transformation of the floor plan. It was a space that was completely done out of curbs in the interior. We see the two dance floors, they are always there. We see that on top of the dance floors there is a circle, which is the DJ booth as well. And we will explain in more detail how this DJ booth was even more special than the previous one. And what is interesting about this interior space is that the architect, Vincenzo Carmenati, this Italian architect that moved from Milan to Costa Brava, did this kind of a sculpture model of the discotheque and was thinking of a space that was centrifugal, no? That had no center, that had no weight, that was almost floating, and it's all these cylinders that float. And this translates into the interior in this duplicity, in which all the ceiling is full of cylinders, but also all the lower part is full of cylinders. So there is this effect of a grotto, no? We saw all these stalactites also in Tiffany's, but here they became just bigger and they look like floating kind of cylinders, and on the bottom you have exactly the same. So there is no top or bottom, you can just flip it. And we can see as well how they make this trick to camouflage the columns, no? So here on the right you have a column, and we see that there is a white cylinder on the top, a black kind of strip in the middle, and another white cylinder on the bottom, with this intentionality of not seeing how the building is actually held in terms of gravity. Also, the back walls are painted in black. So when it's all dark inside, when the lights are on, you don't have the sense of where this building finishes. So there is an intentionality of having this infinite interiority. You know? It's like an interior that it's never ending, that it's supporting all these effects of light, sound, and rhythm. And what is interesting about this building also is that I found this drawing, this archive, which is the earliest drawing that I managed to find in general, globally, of this triad of relationships that we see in that drawing on the left, on that elevation, which is precisely a group of dancers on the dance floor on the left. Then in the middle, slightly elevated on a platform, the DJ, and then above the DJ on another platform is a go-go dancer. So this is the triad of the discotheque, no? So how the people dances, the DJ manages the night, and then how the go-go dancer is also the channel of a style for the space. Here is the floor plan of the DJ booth that will translate into this DJ booth in Maddox in 66. And it's circular. We can see that it's like a control panel, the DJ/BJ, because at that time the same person will do both things, will control the lights, and will have an assistant. So if he didn't have enough with 2 hands, the assistant will help. But it was the same person doing both things. And he could control all these technologies around him. No? We can see turntables, there is also magnetic records, and we see all the buttons to control the lights and so on. So the DJ will become this master of ceremonies for the first time, and the architecture is the one that brought it into this position of power by elevating it, giving it the booth, and putting the booth in a position of control also over the dance floors. We see how the technologies are incorporated, the lighting technologies are also incorporated in the ceiling, as we saw in Tiffany's. This is an early picture, but technologies were advancing very fast. So every year they were adding new lights. They were adding new sound technologies. It was not something stable. No? These discotheques were evolving constantly. And we can see how this turned into Maddox. This film has no sound, but we can see how also there were lighting projectors. These projectors were covering these non-flat surfaces. The use of stroboscopic lights that became popular in all these discotheques, how they were coming from in between the cylinders hanging on the top, how the podiums enhance all these bodies dancing, how the crowd is affected by all this lighting, how speakers are of the size of a person at that time. So between Tiffany's and Maddox, we saw how architecture developed an envelope, a form, in order to contain all these technologies that were technologies that initially, as we said, were coming not only, but also from military developments. The military complex were introduced into discotheque. We see this correlation with the lighting. We see that also, as part of the development plans and the agreement with the states, Spanish engineers were sent to the States to learn, and they came back to Spain. It's very difficult to trace the exact name of the person that studied in the States and then developed these technologies for the discotheque, but there was definitely an atmosphere that there was knowledge transfer from the States to the Spain, and we see companies like Lumex in Barcelona that was developing all these first technological lighting effects for the discotheque. So we see from the searchlight of the military to these forms of lighting for entertainment. We see also correlations between this chronophotographic gun that Virilio situates at the beginning. It's a military instrument at the beginning of cinema, and how this translates to these projectors that project lights and colors and forms on top of the walls of the discotheque. No? They have the cannon, they have this circular element. One is capturing images, the other is projecting images, but the concept is exactly the same. We see how the subwoofer makes its way into the discotheque. In Maddox, I managed to interview, before he died, the DJ of Maddox, the historical DJ of Maddox. And he was explaining how there was no knowledge at the beginning about how to use sound technologies. So they were playing a little bit with them, and they discovered that if they would put the lower frequencies on the lower parts of the discotheque, it will work better. So they decided to make these spaces under the podiums and to introduce the subwoofers there, while the higher pitch will come from above and directed more towards the face and the torso, let's say, of the dancers. And they were putting sand from the beach under the speakers because the speakers were so rudimentary that they were vibrating too much, or that will actually halt a bit the vibrations. And it was like a test. Year by year, they were somehow transforming this sort of technology of the subwoofer invented to affect the bowels of the enemy into a technology to affect the bowels and the body of the dancer. It happens the same with LSD, obviously. So it's not only that LSD arrived into these discotheques through the hippies that arrived before Ibiza, actually they arrived in Costa Brava, but also that LSD produced a full aesthetic experience and culture. So the way in which lights were using in these discotheques was to simulate the experience of having LSD, and also it will enhance, if you will take LSD, the experience inside the discotheque, but not only LSD, also amphetamines, because Franco was the only Western country, so Spain under Franco was the only Western country that didn't sign any agreement against drugs. So amphetamines were sold off the counter on the pharmacies. Antonio Escotado, an historian of drugs, says that in half of Spain was high all the time, no? Because everybody, like from the housewife to, and on moments of festivities, the selling of amphetamines will skyrocket and so on. So there was a massive consumption of amphetamines, and also the tourists will go to buy the amphetamines. It was called the pharmacy of Europe, no? You could go there, buy the amphetamines, go back to France or whatever. So with that, we arrive at the first part of the first proposition, that it's that the discotheque is this architecture of waves, no? That abuses technology, abuses lighting technologies and produces lighting waves, and abuses sound technology with this sound wave, and also brain waves, no? Through the use of psychotropic technologies, and creates this infinite interiority, which is the experience of the discotheque. I showed Maddox, but Maddox was one. I managed to identify more than 200, not with the same level of information. And there is a very partial investigation. I only checked the northern part of Spain. I didn't have time to go down because it will take me years to go to all the villages and ask for the floor plans if they find them. But I'm sure there are many more, no? So 200 is just like the top of the iceberg of all these discotheques. There was this report on the press at that time. No? The Spanish voix, particularly the Catalan ones, have set a trend, have created a style, have done the revolution and attracted the youth of all countries. Tiffany's, that in Platja d'Aro is known as the indestructible, has influenced a pop period of Hispano-touristic night. The youth, the most in, the most shocking, the most extravagant, with less prejudice and insecurities, have crowded the venue night after night. Later in Torremolinos, it has been established as the club of the important nights. After this conquest, the Spanish boat takes off to conquer the world. And many of these discotheques had actually a chain around Europe. No? So Tiffany's started opening, had in Playa de Aros, but in Torremolinos, but in Munich, in Perpignan, in Palma de Mallorca, in Tel Aviv, in Montpellier, and so on. And the same with Maddox, and maybe you're more familiar with other chains like Pachá that opened many years later, and so on. No? So there was an expansion of these discotheques. There is also Kiko Riera, which was a technician of sound in one of these discotheques, that claims I opened more than 100 discotheques in Europe after the model of Tiffany's. It's difficult to prove if it's true or not, but for sure there was an impact that went beyond the borders of Spain. And here we go to the second proposition, a bit shorter, which is the idea of intensities, and thinking the discotheque as a container of these intensities and producer of these intensities. If we think of late capitalism and we look at Jameson, no? He says, now we need to complete this exploratory account of postmodernist space and time with a final analysis of that euphoria or those intensities which seem to often characterize the newer cultural experience of this late or liberal capitalism that arrived in Spain by the hand of the states. But I particularly like the work of a Spanish based in America scholar, Teresa Villaros, that analyzes that period of time in Spain, and says that Spain was a tentative post-industrial state at that moment, no? Introducing tourism as its main industry, that by the means of a drastic intervention on an economy of intensities, acts to ominously imagine how the state can always preserve the biopolitical circulation, not of the being anymore, not of an essence of the citizen, which is indifferent, but of the body, how the state can use these intensities to make the bodies circulate as a form also of good. And she continues, promoted and produced by the state through Información y Turismo, information and tourism, which was one of the ministries, one of the power ministries within the rule of Franco. The decade inaugurates the decade of the 60s, a form of biopolitical exercise that ultimately, and through the spectacular use of mass entertainment technologies, here the discotheque as one of the mass entertainment technologies, appears capable of erasing or blurring the line separating the citizen from the non-subject, as an alternative configuration of the political. In 1960s Spain, the new non-subject of Western postmodernity is born, thanks to the grand invention of tourism, and I add, of the discotheque, no? With the help of the discotheque. And how precisely, and now we will analyze a bit more how the discotheque becomes displaced into produce this new subject. As we were saying before, in the proto-discotheques, they started playing with levels. This is the floor plan of levels of Maddox. The architects said very intentionally, I want to create many different levels, so I possibilitate cross-site and cross-views. Everybody can see each other in the discotheque. And then the invention, I find this really interesting, actually, the invention of the podium. Because it might seem very obvious nowadays, like, of course, a podium for a go-go, who cares, no? But it didn't exist before. And when you look at the history of the podium, it's a bit unclear. Some say, it appeared in California in the mid-60s, in the Whiskey a Go-Go in Los Angeles. They put a table and somebody was dancing on top. Obviously, stages existed for immemorial times, no? And elevated platforms of all kinds. But this specificity of individual elevated platform for one single body, obviously two people can go up, but it's thought for this one single body that populates around the dance floor, it's an invention of the 60s. And it works as a technology of body production. We can see the podiums of Maddox and how they even integrated the stair to go up into the podium as this kind of cylinders. It was an obsession with the cylinder. So this podium elevates one body above the others, the body of the go-go dancer. But it's not only one go-go dancer, it's not unifocal, no? But it's multifocal, because you start having several go-go dancers that are dancing at higher levels around you. But also these podiums can be colonized by the dancers, no? So you start having all these dancers at different levels, looking at each other. You are showing, you're the protagonist, but you are also the viewer. And Roland Barthes has a beautiful text about discotheques from the 60s in which he says precisely that the discotheque is a theater, but inside out, everyone is the protagonist. Everyone is part of the public. Everyone is illuminated. All the bodies are under the focus of the light. So these bodies start to be produced in the discotheque. They start coming down from the ceilings as well, no? So they present all these bodies and they start to present them naked, which is also a revolution for Spain. It's a national Catholic country in which the church had a strong power over morality, and we see in these spaces of exception, that is the discotheque, that all these bodies, almost naked, start appearing. Mostly women, quite sexist approach, but also sometimes men. And start all the competitions of beauty. Women have numbers. It's not anymore about the identity of anybody, but it's all these bodies circulating, showing the intensities of their beauty, the intensities of their attributes. And we see them in bikinis, and we see them in many discotheques. In summer, there was contest of beauty in every discotheque on the coast. We see the first Mr. Spain appearing also in Maddox, no? And we see all these reports on the measurement of the muscles of one man and the back and so on. So the body starts to be measured as well, no? And this idea of the reproduction of the cool body or the beautiful body. And they are affected by the lights of the discotheque. So fashion photographers and publicists go to the discotheque to shot there. This is the case of a woman under the lights and the effects of color of the discotheque. And Virilio also talks about the lighting effects decomposing the body in the discotheque. No? So it says the better discos employ stroboscopic lights so that people's dance movements can be cut into their individual faces. Much like film editing, the 20th century, in other words, has successfully imported a film effect into everyday life. So the idea of projecting the mechanisms of mass media as film or even magazines into the living body in the discotheque by the use of light. A light that also dissolves this body, so it's not only a singular body, but this body starts to merge with the other bodies in the dance floor, with their projections, with their syncopated movements. And Virilio, again, talking about magazines, says this body with no stable dimensions will soon be offered up in fragments to the audience. In the discotheque, you see the bodies in fragments. Under the flashing light, you see one maybe hand moving, one hip going to the right. In a repetition of heterogeneous, in the repetition of the heterogeneous perception of the voyeur, attention was drawn to a blow-up detail, the legs, the eyes, the bottom, whatever. So we see this body already decomposing into the intensities of beauty, youth, and coolness. And this brings the go-go dancer, which is this other invention that obviously dancers have existed all the time, but this idea of a dancer that doesn't replicate certain forms of dance, but it's there to show that she's authentic, that she's the coolest, that she dresses the best, and that she's the one that actually cheers up the party. That's something very much invented at that time. And what is quite fascinating when you look at all the go-go dancers that populate these podiums in the discotheque, in the Spanish discotheques, is that most of them are racialized bodies. So they were flying dancers from anywhere else but not Europe into the coast of Spain to dance in these podiums. Difference and the intensity of difference and the exoticization of the body, the intensity of the exoticization of the body becomes also a product. And you have these advertisements that says, Yuki, the first go-go authentically Asian go-go dance has arrived to the Costa Brava, no? And it's proclaimed as this big thing. Looked in perspective, obviously, it's quite violent. But at the time, it's how it was sold, the role of the go-go. And we saw in the newspapers also that this became a war, no? Which discotheque will have the coolest go-go, and then the newspapers will report on that and will give points to one discotheque and points to the other discotheque, trying to actually attract the public to these dancing nights. And I really like how Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, which is a Spanish thinker, a brilliant thinker of that period of time in Spain, makes an analogy between the go-go dancer and the machine of the governance, no? And says, if the go-go girls fall from the podium, the collective epileptic movement will stop. The lights will normalize reality. The turntable will grin to a shameful retreat. And the faces, as they look at each other, will discover the footprint of tomorrow, filled with schedules, duties, filled with the same words, the same betrayals, filled with the defeats turned into victories through monologues. No, the go-go girl knows she must not fall. Her balance is the balance of the night chosen by all who share with her the act of renunciation. This text, written under the dictatorship, being ironic, is much longer, mostly says the rhythm of the go-go dancer on top of the podium is what keeps this illusion of progress. Is this what keeps the illusion that the dictatorship somehow brings certain form of economic development to the country, that also brings certain forms of freedom, and therefore we keep supporting the dictatorship. There is no go-go, there is no dictatorship. So there is something interesting in this analogy. And we can see how the go-gos obviously dance and also will teach to dance. So another scene from inside Maddox.
Esto no te divierte mucho, ¿verdad?
¿Por qué lo dices, Juan?
Pues no sabría decírtelo. En estos sitios me siento como un muchacho. Ahora verás cómo se me da a mí el baile.
So we see that the go-gos dance, and obviously they represent this model to follow. And we see that there is a transition from dancing in couples, that was still the common form of dancing at the beginning of the 60s, into dancing individually. And we see all these journalists fascinated by that, no? Saying like this one, that I saw boys dancing alone and girls twisting and moving on their own all over the dance floor, no? As if it was like a radical form of occupying this public space. And we see that the dance is a form of also language. No? I like that Preciado says that language is contagious. So if we understand dance as a body language, dance is also infectious. But you can also try to trespass these gestures into other bodies. Actually, the team of go-go dancers of Maddox used to wear these t-shirts that was saying Maddox University, no? As if they were teaching the others something. And they definitely were. And they were also bringing teachers to help to teach dance, and mostly they were black men, actually. At that time in Spain, all these new genres of music that were arriving, psychedelic rock, yeye, and so on, were considered modern music. They were called música moderna, that was supposedly coming from abroad. And in theory, people, white Europeans, didn't know how to dance it. So they had to bring all these black bodies to teach them these new genres that many of them came from, obviously, black diasporic communities in America. So we see these teachers teaching the white European tourists, but also the local Spanish Catholic youth, how to dance to música moderna. And then we have these dancing competitions, but we also have a music industry that is growing at the time in Spain, a very big one also because they will export to all Latin America, that invents all the summer hits. What is considered the first summer hit, La Yenka, this is from the early 60s, they all come with their own choreographies as well. No? So there is ways of moving the body. We all imagine this yeye style of southern parts of Europe in the early 60s of moving the body. No? So this is inflicted on the body. It's not that people spontaneously start to just do it, no? But there is certain channels of contagion of these forms of movement. And we have, again, this journalist fascinated. I saw a local girl caught my attention because she had perfectly assimilated foreign fashions. She wore a mini blouse that revealed a strip of deeply tanned skin. She moved with certain calm and absolute fidelity to the latest rhythms. She wore very tight gray pants. Her hips swayed gently. Sometimes she would bring her hands together to gaze into the distance with those white, starlit eyes and a certain abrupt or aggressive tone. She was possessed, no? Like this woman here, by música moderna and the rhythms of música moderna that had infected her body. And it was not only an individual infection, but it was some form of collective infection. All these bodies converge together. Now, in more recent times, all these theories about the dance floor talk about this communion of emotions. No? So all these bodies merging together with the rhythms and intensities of the dance floor, the infection of the movements, and so on. And obviously, that had a consequence in fashion. No? So not only everybody was potentially fashionable in these spaces, but every discotheque had its own shop in which they sell some form of fashion garments, but also fashion shows started to appear in all these discotheques, and it was the beginning of important designers later in Spain that showed first in Costa Brava, for instance, in this kind of passerelles, like Elio Bernhayer that ended up designing, for instance, all the uniforms for Iberia, which is the flying company, and then later we all know the history of fast fashion in Spain, Zara, and so on. So there is some sort of link of these kind of spaces and the boom, let's say, of fast fashion in Spain that brought very big fashion companies later on. So we are reaching the end, no? The understanding that the discotheque with its podiums, with the infliction of lights on the body, fragmenting these bodies, but also using rhythm, infecting the bodies with rhythm through the go-go dancers, is an architecture that becomes a platform from rethinking the body, you know, representing the body in other forms, and producing the body in other forms. There is a displacement of desire in all this process. Villaros says that before there was desire for the proletariat, no, as this class that could do a revolution, maybe against Franco, and now desire is just desire. There is nothing else. It's desire for the body, desire for desire, the intensity of desire with nothing else. And it's Villaros as well who says that it's the hegemonic Western bodies that are recomposed and toasted on the beaches. And here we add also in the discotheque, no? By the flash, by the music. All of them ultimately disposable and reusable bodies, fragmented bodies, broken bodies, diffuse and uncontained bodies. This post-industrial body that it's not political anymore. This body that goes from the autarky of before a society of strict disciplinary control into a society in which the intensity of desire is a new form of control. So I would want to think the discotheque not as a place of leisure, but actually the discotheque as a factory, because the discotheque is a factory of intensities, the intensities that are used as a form of governance by the late Franco government to introduce also liberalism into Europe by the hand of the states. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really, really fantastic talk, and I could have stayed watching videos of 1960s Spanish discos for quite some time. I think we all could. So I just thought I'd maybe open up the discussion a bit. I mean, you can see there's like a wealth of material and wealth of ideas that we're just really seeing some of the tapping into the surface of. Yeah, just those dancing. I love watching the kind of different dancing, and then I think you talked about how there is this kind of increasing informality and kind of maybe more kind of sexual dancing and less in couples. But even then, to see the amount of like sweat and kind of hedonism and losing oneself in those early videos, I think is quite a useful corrective for thinking about how hedonism might be a more recent phenomenon in some kind of way. And just the amount of material that you've found, archival. You talked about over 200 nightclubs that you're thinking about in just one area, and the different types of material that you're working with. So thinking about film, and you talked about like legal documents at the very beginning, and I think that's partly it's such a challenging area to research, right? There isn't the kind of, it's historically not been included in architecture and design history, and plans aren't kept for all sorts of reasons. So all those ways that you've navigated it as a quite challenging field, I think, is really interesting. One of the things I kept on thinking about the whole time was these two dance floors. Yeah. Like, it's a really interesting kind of spatial layout question. And I wondered if there's any more thoughts on what that might be about.
That's a complete mystery, as I was saying before, because I really don't understand why they were having two dance floors. In some reports, some of the architects will say, yes, we are including two dance floors because if it's very busy, they can use both. So somehow suggesting that maybe they will open only one, but nevertheless, it was a completely open space. So it is very difficult to actually, with certain evidence, say why they were having this two dance floors. I don't know if it was the same case in Italy, because there is a parallel, obviously, development of discotheques. It's not that they happen only in Spain, no? There is other territories in which, at the same time, discotheques appear in slightly different ways, no? There is some particularity of the Spanish ones. As far as I know, but probably you can know better, in Italy, this phenomenon of the two dance floors, it was not so common.
No, not at all. No, so yeah, that's my kind of area of particular interest. I was thinking about Italian discos, which first appeared in 1965 in Rome, and then my particular focus is the kind of architectural experiments that kind of appear in Florence and Turin and Milan in the late 60s and early 70s. I mean, if they did have two dance floors, it's because they were on different levels, but often they were much smaller spaces and already much more technological, I guess I would say, and much more that kind of artificially controlled environment than what you're talking about. So yeah, it's a different thing. I mean, I guess you mentioned there that the idea of how one would be like opened and one closed depending on the amount of people in the space, and that's one of the things I was thinking about. So for example, Studio 54, they didn't have two dance floors, but they had it was many things, the building it was in, but at some point it was also a theatre. And so they had big curtains that they would suspend from the ceiling, and then when it was quiet, you'd feel like you had the kind of intensity of a crowd, and then as both spaces filled up, they would then open the curtain. So, that kind of, the space was working hard to be part of the kind of performance, the same places that you're talking about here. And then I think also it's something about maybe how long you were meant to spend in that space. Because it's very much you arrive, I don't know what time you would arrive, it's all day, right? So you could be on it's a kind of very much a spatial, temporal kind of journey, to use that word, that you would move around different spaces in the course of the evening or into the early hours. So I guess it's another way that those spaces are about control in all sorts of ways.
Another hypothesis to add on that, which I completely agree, although, for instance, the division of a space was not possible in most of these early proto-discotheques or discotheques because they were just open, is also that the business worked because they were selling alcohol, actually. So the music was there to bring the people there to drink. And most of the times around the dance floors is where they will situate all the tables, where the people will sit to drink. So another potential hypothesis is that if you have more perimeter to put tables, more people sitting around the dance floors, and therefore potentially more people drinking. No? And these kind of rhythms of the night that Angel Perez, the DJ of Matrix, was explaining very well how they were agreed with the owners of the discotheque. Okay, you will play quick music for 1 hour, people get tired, then you play slow music for half an hour, so they go to the bar and they drink and they sit on the table, and then again, quick music and so on. So for the 8 hours of the session, this spatial configuration of the floor plan might have to do with that, no? With the possibility of sitting and also seeing who is dancing. And the more people can sit and see who is dancing, the more playful, let's say, but also the more profitable the experience of the business might be.
Yeah, and I think that's, you're looking at a very particular kind of sector, like the tourism sector, and I think the places that I've looked at, like commerce was the last thing that they were thinking about. In fact, architects don't run nightclubs very well. I mean, I need to be corrected on that, but most of them closed because they, for various reasons, they just couldn't work them as businesses. It was tough to be both an architect and a businessman. But the design of the space was less thinking about profit in that kind of way. It was more that the losing oneself in a very controlled kind of way, I guess. And I guess that, thinking about your work and listening to you speak about it, that tension between control and freedom seems to be really, it comes across in all sorts of ways, from the design of the space itself, as we've been talking about, to technologies, and also environmental control as being, talk about air conditioning as being quite important. And and then the politics around it of, this kind of really interesting kind of oddity of like this, a dictatorship making up a space for this kind of freedom. And I just wondered if you, could talk to that maybe.
Yeah, for me, this is one of the key aspects, let's say, of the research, and maybe I didn't have time today to nuance all that, no? But it's precisely the ambiguity of these spaces, because we can say that they are spaces of very strict control in the way that they control the body, because with the rhythm of the music, you're almost controlling the movements of that body. So bodies are almost like puppets of the DJ, if you want to put it like this, but also are spaces of freedom. And despite most of these discotheques and the way that they presented them was like all these factories of the dictatorship, no, to control citizenship, they were also kind of the possibility of having certain forms of resistance into the spaces. You were talking before about this body sweating, also some forms of countercultural music entering some of these discotheques, not all of them. So those are spaces that, yes, mostly we can read them as these spaces of control by also controlling desire and linking it to consumerism at that time. There are also spaces that certain forms of resistance can grow within them, because you can reappropriate these technologies. So these technologies can be reappropriated by anyone. And actually we see this later in history. No? So I talked about a very specific historic moment and a very specific geography. But then we all know that club culture is much broader, and that there is many moments in which these spaces of dancing with all these technologies can be associated with certain forms of emancipation. But I see a very clear difference between Italy. No? As you were saying, I feel that the night spaces of Italy were experimental spaces that were not only constrained to dancing. Dancing was one component, but it was about experimental theater. It was about exhibitions. It was about all sorts of performance, of coming together and experimenting with different forms of media, no? With projections, lighting, sound, and so on. While here it was quite much more contained within the idea of dancing to recorded music. No? As a discotheque later evolved, and what we called a discotheque, we relate it maybe more with this, and the Italian nightclubs relate them more with an experimental black box, linked also with a more elitist and intellectual understanding of space and architecture.
Absolutely, and I think maybe we can talk about this in a bit, because I'm interested in also like the international exchange of ideas. We talked about the technologies, but the myth around nightclubs or discos, and you're good to kind of differentiate between them, is that it was in 1955 when Regine Zilberberg in Whiskey A Go-Go in Paris decided to put two records on at the same time, And she apparently, and also to stand on a table and wave her arms around to produce lighting effects. And she apparently wanted to have the music continuous because she didn't like the sound of people snogging in between the records, to sort of cover it up with the music, which are, ridiculous in many ways, but quite nice. But you've got this kind of origin story, and then which has many different origins before it, and then cultures around it. And then in Italy, it takes on a particular guise, and this is what I'm kind of still fascinated by, that in the late 60s, it kind of entered architecture schools, actually. So in Florence University, there's a tutor called Leonardo Savioli, and he teaches a course that's all about Piper, which was the name of the first discotheque, or Piper, and that as an architecture of leisure. And it was seen, this form of the discotheque, or proto-discotheque, I like how you talk about that, as both a new spatial typology that was about a very different relationship between the architect, the space, and the user. So you could move things around in very kind of simple ways. You had a lot more agency in the space, which was again kind of pushing against architectural convention. And so for these architects like Gruppo 9999, who designed and ran a club called Space Electronic, they saw themselves, or can see them now, as inventing a new spatial typology that was about also at the same time as new social customs and new behaviours and new kind of musical genres. And you're right, there was a kind of openness to them, that they had theatre, jazz, they had an architecture school on the dance floor, they grew vegetables on the dance floor, like they're this real kind of, we'd call it multidisciplinary kind of possibility to it, which as it gets more codified and commercialised, sort of falls away to a degree.
Yeah, and as you were saying also, they were much more modular, no? You could have different components of the discotheque reconfigured depending on what was happening that night, no? And I remember seeing images of these theater shows in which they have like big swimming pools inside, and that there is a playfulness of the different architectural forms, while in the Spanish discotheques they are much more rigid, no? Like the place of the DJ is the place of the DJ and cannot be moved, and even the seating in many of the discotheques is built in. At the beginning in the proto-discotheques not, but then it's like, here is the stool and you cannot move it, no? So the choreography, let's say, of the bodies in the Spanish discotheques is much more controlled, no? And it's not adaptable to different forms of the situation. But there was definitely, as well as we were commenting the other day, talking, an exchange of knowledge between some of these discotheques, because what is considered the first Italian discotheque, the Piper in Rome, no? We maybe say that's the first one. The owner of that discotheque was very close friend of the owner of Maddox as well, no? And then they will do a trip of dancers from Maddox to Rome to dance in the Piper, and then trip from dancers of Piper to come to dance to Maddox. But also Carmenati is an Italian architect, but then there was Cesare Fiorese, who was like a lighting designer that mostly worked with experimental theater in Italy, but then he came to Costa Brava to start designing also the lighting infrastructures of some of these discotheques. So there was definitely, around the Mediterranean coast, a certain form of connection of expertise and between promoters, architects, designers. It was always a form of collective also effort of design. No? It's very difficult to say a discotheque was designed by this person, because it was never one single person. The case of Maddox is an Italian architect with a local architect, with a designer of lighting, with a promoter that had many ideas on how to design the interior, and the four of them, or even more people, ended up designing what will be the interior of that discotheque.
And actually, I think, sort of having curated a couple of exhibitions thinking about nightclubs and architecture, that's when I really realised the limits of one kind of even multidisciplinary set of knowledge, because you need to have that kind of expertise in lighting and sound and DJs coming together to kind of understand it. And then I think also, the States has got that, it's that military kind of equipment and technology, but then also the countercultural experiments, the Fillmore in San Francisco, or Exploding Plastic Inevitable, with kind of performances by the Velvet Underground in New York. Like there is a kind of international set of experimentation that kind of is coming through in these spaces, I think. But would you say that the architectural community, as it were, in Spain was interested in this as a phenomenon? Like, was it seen as something architectural or not?
I don't think so at the time, because there was the big names of architecture of the time that we might remember. I don't know, Bofill, for instance, no? Like some architects that were populating that area, and that you could think that they were very progressist. I have hardly ever heard them talking about those spaces, and I'm sure they maybe went there because it was not that far from where they were living. It was the time, and it was the nightclubs that the intellectual elite will also frequent, because Costa Brava was tourists, but also the intellectual elite counter-Francoist intellectual elite of Catalonia will go to spend the summers in that area. So I'm sure they will go into these spaces. It's well known that Dalí, for instance, was going into this kind of spaces, but not in the stereography of architecture. They don't appear at all. And I've been very lucky because one of the good parts of the Franco regime being so controlling is that there is all these archives in every village of everything that was built. Particularly in the part of Catalonia, more in the southern part is a bit more difficult. And then you find all these floor plans and so on, but it doesn't come from an appreciation from the architectural discipline. And not in the time I found any text that actually praises the qualities of the discotheque. In the 80s it's different. Boigas, which is the one that transformed Barcelona during the Olympic Games, have these texts about the discotheques in Barcelona in the 80s. Yes, fantastic, but not in the 60s. So I think the appreciation for this kind of spaces comes a bit later during democratic times, and not looking back, because there was a pact of oblivion in Spain as well. So the transition from the dictatorship towards democracy somehow put a curtain and nobody looked back. So for me, being of a generation that actually was born after the dictatorship, discovering that all this was happening in the dictatorship is quite surprising. And when I share this with other people, it's a bit the same sort of surprise. So even within the architectural profession, I think there was a sort, despite many architects were participating in even being local architects for some discotheques if the designer was an international designer.
And is that something to do with Franco's particular ideology or lack thereof? Because I was reading something about this recently, that he didn't actually really have a kind of strong political position in terms of what he actually believed in. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think there is a transition over the development of the dictatorship. We could say at the beginning, yes, but then there is a transition to a technocratic government. There is this religious organization, Opus, that enters the government of Spain, and then the Opus have all these technocratic people that occupies different government positions. In between them, the Ministry of Tourism and Information. So tourism and propaganda comes together. Tourism, discotheque, and propaganda is one single thing, in a way. And Fraga, which is one of them, one of these technocrats, opens up the economy, makes all these propagandistic propositions through tourist guides and so on, showing how Spain is fantastic, everybody's happy, fiesta, and so on. And there is a transition from the moralities of the national Catholicism as a form of ideology into the amorality of progressism. And that has been studied in different ways by different scholars, but yes, there is this kind of transition during the years of the dictatorship from the 40s until the 60s, that it's a radical change. And many historians, more and more, they say, yes, we all talk about the transition as happening in 75, when Franco dies, but the real transition is the change of forms of government that happens between the 60s and the early 70s. And it's precisely the adoption of all these leisure cultures, the economy of experience, libidinal economies as form of governance with the guidance of the states. And that's the real transition of Spain. Then, yes, we will vote and we will have elections and so on. But all the mechanisms to sustain this like Western democracy were put before through the development of this new ideology of governance through desires.
And that political transition is so interesting. So also similarly in Portugal with the Carnation Revolution, it was these kind of nightlife spaces that were key actually to that kind of democratic transition. So it's these moments when you wouldn't think that discos are important, but actually it's taking them seriously in the way that you have, I think, really shows the value.
I think there is a super interesting relationship between dictatorship and nightclubs, which I want to keep on exploring because I haven't studied in detail, but I know it's the same case in Argentina. I know it's the same case in Chile, apparently. So there was a proliferation of night spaces during the dictatorship. You can go back to Roman times, no? Circus and bread, and there is something similar, no? We keep on inflicting all the repression, but we keep you distracted with all these discotheques and everybody dancing half naked, so everything is going is going well, but there is censorship, no? You cannot publish this magazine, or you cannot talk in this language, and so on. So there was an ambiguity of these spaces, and the use of the party and the space for dancing as a counterbalance to the power of dictatorships. It's something that apparently is quite recurrent. So I'm interested in expanding this sort of investigation.
Yeah, there's much more, as we can see. But maybe see if there's any questions from the floor. We can, one question. There's one in the corner of it.
Oh, no, a microphone.
There is a microphone, so we can...
I can project.
Oh.
You discovered discotheques in Costa Brava, but did you explore any in Barcelona?
Yes, there were...
What's the favorite?
Yeah, there were... Sorry, you want to say something?
No, what was the favorite?
What was my favorite?
Yeah, or your favorite now.
Well, I haven't been to any of these, obviously. I was not alive. What was my favorite discotheque? That's very difficult to say. I went through different phases. But one of my first discotheques in Barcelona is very similar to the discotheque that Roland Barthes describes in Paris, which is Le Palace in Paris, and Barcelona it's called Apollo. Okay, which are two theaters reconverted into discotheques. And for me, it was a genuine experience. Actually, now that you put this question, I will very briefly explain. All this investigation comes already from when I was a student in Barcelona, because I studied architecture in Barcelona. And everything that we were designing were like housing or a studio for an artist or a museum. No, they were all these very elevated or social programs or very elevated programs, no, like something that had to do with high arts. But I was going out in Barcelona. I was going to all these nightclubs. I was like, wow, these spaces are impressive. Why nobody's talking about them? And there was the moment also in the 90s, there was a boom of design in Barcelona. So when I was going out in the 2000s, there was all these night spaces designed during the Olympic Games and after the Olympic Games with all these new designers. And they were quite impressive in the use that they were doing of lighting and the effects and everything. And I was like, why nobody's talking about this? So already when I was in school, it started this interest that I've been carrying for years and years now into developing into this PhD. But I guess Apollo could be the trigger, actually, as a space that I really liked, I really loved. A theater reconverted in discotheque, as Bart says, no? Like everyone is the protagonist there, and that somehow triggered this investigation, I guess. And
I feel really terrible, but we have to give our AV team eventually the night off. But I just want to thank both of you. I really feel like we scratched the surface, and I could listen to you all night, both of you. Absolutely fascinating. But perhaps over a drink, a few people could ask you questions in person.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you'll have lots of them. I have the privilege of being able to see you most of the time, so I will save my questions. Thank you so much, Paul and Kat. Absolutely amazing evening. And thank you to all.
Thank you.